Welcome to my channel. Subscribe to the channel and listen to my stories every day. The story begins in the blur of an early Saturday morning, with the kids still asleep and sunlight just beginning to edge through the blinds. I was deep in the clutter of our garage, motivated by the promise of an organized space for a change. Dust motes floated in the air as I lifted old boxes, shifting through forgotten items we'd accumulated over nearly a decade together. Our lives felt like that garage, layered, comfortable, slightly chaotic but reassuringly familiar. Claire was out, having left with friends for a weekend away, something I encouraged since she'd been working tirelessly in marketing for a small firm downtown. The kids and I had a cozy weekend planned, a pizza and movie night and maybe a trip to the park. Life felt good, calm, like everything was falling into place as it should. As I sorted through piles of holiday decorations, camping gear, and old tools, I uncovered a dusty old suitcase shoved behind a stack of boxes. I recognized the suitcase instantly. It was one Claire had used for work trips in the past, a navy blue roller bag with a broken zipper she'd promised to replace but hadn't. Curious, I pulled it out, chuckling to myself. Maybe there was a forgotten souvenir from one of her countless trips, some little trinket the kids could have. When I unzipped it, though, I found something else, a strange collection of souvenirs from cities I didn't recall her ever mentioning. A snow globe from New York, a tiny Statue of Liberty, a postcard from Orlando, and keychains from a few other cities stared back at me like silent accusations. A knot of unease formed in my stomach. Claire had never mentioned trips to New York or Orlando, and I couldn't recall a single business trip she'd taken to either city. It was strange, but I brushed it off as maybe gifts she'd gotten for friends or colleagues. But then, one item in particular caught my eye, a set of theater tickets, folded neatly with dates from months prior. I sat there, staring at those tickets, wondering why she'd been to a Broadway show without ever telling me. My mind raced, conjuring up excuses, plausible explanations. Still, doubt crept in, a whisper I couldn't shake off. By the time she returned home late Sunday night, I was on edge, trying not to betray my unsettled thoughts. She seemed tired but cheerful, hugging the kids and chatting about her low-key weekend. Watching her laugh, the unease inside me twisted painfully. She was my wife, my best friend, the mother of my children. I wanted to believe her, to trust her, yet something wasn't right. And so, the suspicion nestled in my chest, simmering quietly, waiting for me to take action. Over the next week, I tried to push my doubts aside, convincing myself I was being paranoid. Claire had never given me any reason to doubt her. But once the suspicion had taken root, it was impossible to ignore. Every late-night email or unexplained work trip fed the nagging unease, until finally, I couldn't take it any longer. One evening, when she was out with friends again, I sat at her desk and opened her laptop. I felt a pang of guilt, like I was intruding on her privacy. But the unease that had been building up inside me for days overpowered the guilt. I clicked on her email icon, convincing myself that I was only checking for something innocuous. Maybe I'd find an email chain from her boss or confirmations of business trips that would explain the souvenirs. The emails were there, hundreds of them. I scrolled through names, dates, subject lines, searching for anything that might offer an explanation. That's when I saw it. The name Jeremy popped up again and again, in emails stretching back months. My heart hammered in my chest as I clicked on the latest one, a simple subject line that read, "Thinking of you." The message was brief, but enough to make my world spin. Inside jokes, small comments about their time spent together. I opened another email, then another. Each one painted a picture of a relationship that was far too close, far too personal for simple coworkers. Claire had mentioned Jeremy once, a new colleague she'd been paired with for a big project. I remembered her talking about him with a casual indifference, like he was just another face in the office. I kept reading, feeling numb as I skimmed through their exchanges, messages that escalated from friendly to intimate, conversations that hinted at weekends away together. Words like, miss you, and, can't wait, jumped off the screen, slicing through me with an ache I couldn't ignore. This wasn't the Claire I knew. This wasn't the woman I'd married, the mother of my children. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, feeling like I'd stumbled into someone else's life. Days turned into a restless haze, and every moment around Claire felt like a test of my endurance. Each smile, each casual touch, every good night kiss became a strange, surreal experience. I held on to the facade of normalcy for the sake of our kids, who were blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. I'd grown quiet around Claire, letting her take the lead in our conversations, my responses short and uncharacteristically absent-minded. She noticed, of course, asking if everything was all right, and I reassured her with a practiced smile that, I'm just a little stressed with work. But I couldn't stay in that limbo forever. I needed answers, something to settle the agonizing uncertainty that gnawed at me every time she left the house or her phone buzzed. So, I did the only thing that made sense in my spiraling mind, I became a detective in my own home. I knew Claire's schedule, her favorite places, the friends she hung out with. I'd been her husband for nearly a decade, and suddenly I was using that knowledge to uncover a part of her life she'd kept hidden from me. One night, when she was showering, I picked up her phone, feeling the heavy weight of betrayal mix with the guilt of snooping. Her phone was locked, of course. But I knew her passcode, our anniversary. It was a small, ironic stab, knowing she hadn't changed it despite everything else. I hesitated, breathing shallowly as I unlocked her phone, feeling like I was peering into a Pandora's box. I navigated to her messages, scrolling down to the now familiar name, Jeremy. I clicked on the conversation thread, my stomach twisting as I read through their texts, the kind of messages that left no room for doubt. Words I'd once thought were reserved for me alone, expressions of longing, tenderness, excitement, all laid bare, scattered across the screen in blunt, merciless detail. Each message was a confirmation of the lies she'd spun so effortlessly, the deception she'd woven into our life together. There were times they'd made plans on weekends I'd thought she was with her family, on nights she'd claimed she was working late. It was all there, an open betrayal, brutally honest in its casualness. After reading through their messages, I sat there, my hands cold and numb. I wanted to storm into the bathroom, confront her then and there, demand to know why she'd done this. But I knew that wouldn't help me now. I wasn't ready to face her, to hear the inevitable excuses and justifications she'd have. No, I wanted to hold on to my composure, to keep my cards close until I had a plan in place. She had deceived me for months, maybe even years. I could wait a few more days to decide my next move. The following week, I began digging deeper. I checked her email again, delving further back into her exchanges with Jeremy. I found confirmations for hotel reservations in the same cities as those mysterious souvenirs, and in some, the reservations were made for 2 guests. I uncovered receipts for dinners, movies, even a little gift shop purchase here and there. Each piece of evidence added another crack in the foundation of our marriage, until I felt like I was staring at the remnants of a life I'd once cherished, now irreparably shattered. One day, I came home early from work, taking advantage of the kids' playdate at a friend's house, and went through the bills. I found discrepancies on her credit card statements, charges to restaurants and hotels that didn't match her work trips. And then I found something I hadn't anticipated: she'd purchased gifts I had never received. They were small things, jewelry, a watch, a pair of expensive cufflinks. Gifts intended for someone else. I felt sick as the realization hit me. I hadn't just lost her, she'd replaced me, filled the void of our marriage with someone else's presence. My rage grew colder, more focused, sharpening with each passing day. By now, I was certain of her betrayal, and I knew that I couldn't let this go. There was no forgiving, no forgetting, no working it out for the sake of our children. She had destroyed our family with her lies, and now I was going to make sure she knew exactly what she'd lost. But I wouldn't do it rashly. I'd seen too many people regret impulsive actions. I wanted her to understand, in excruciating detail, what she'd thrown away. I wanted her to feel the same shock, betrayal, and isolation she'd forced upon me. So, I got in touch with a lawyer. We met at his office in a quiet corner of town, and I laid everything out, my suspicions, the evidence I'd gathered, the way I wanted this to go. He listened, nodding, his expression calm and thoughtful as he walked me through my options. I explained my goal, to keep custody of our children, the house, and to make the divorce swift and decisive. He recommended a private investigator to help me gather further proof, something concrete to bring to court. I agreed, feeling a grim satisfaction settle over me. This wasn't about revenge anymore, it was about protecting my family, my dignity, and ensuring that she couldn't keep lying to my face while living another life behind my back. When I got home that evening, Claire was there, cooking dinner with her usual smile. She asked me about my day, and I managed to respond casually, suppressing the anger that simmered beneath my skin. I played my part, just as she'd done, pretending everything was fine while waiting for the perfect moment to act. Over the next week, the private investigator sent me regular updates, each one a gut punch disguised as a simple report. He'd managed to trail Claire to several of her supposed work events, places where she met with Jeremy, and photographed them together at coffee shops, restaurants, and even the lobby of a downtown hotel. Each photograph added a cruel layer of detail to a picture that had been forming in my mind, Claire laughing, holding his hand, glancing up at him with a smile that used to be reserved for me. I studied the images, forcing myself to confront every bit of pain, burning it into my mind so I wouldn't falter when the time came to act. I wanted to confront her right away, demand an explanation, make her feel the hurt she'd inflicted. But a stronger part of me clung to my plan. After nearly 10 years of marriage, she owed me honesty, but that was something she'd long forfeited. The kids deserved better, and I wanted to shield them from the chaos of an emotional confrontation. I stayed quiet, biding my time, keeping a calm facade around Claire as if nothing had changed, as if I wasn't counting down the days until I could expose her deception. A Saturday afternoon rolled around, one where Claire had planned yet another work event, and I knew Jeremy would be there. I sat in the living room, watching her get ready, applying makeup and perfume in a way I hadn't seen her do in years. I felt a strange calm as I watched her, studying her as though she were a stranger. She didn't notice my gaze, too busy checking her reflection and her phone. When she was finally ready, she kissed me on the cheek, a quick, thoughtless peck, then hurried out the door. I sat there in silence for a long time, trying to understand how I'd let it come to this, how I'd spent years next to someone capable of such betrayal. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I received another update from the investigator. He'd followed Claire to a dinner downtown, where she and Jeremy had laughed together over drinks, her hand lingering on his arm as they shared inside jokes and exchanged secret smiles. The investigator had snapped a few photos discreetly, each one stoking my anger further. After dinner, he followed them to a hotel, where they checked in together, confirming every suspicion I'd harbored. There it was, the final piece I needed, a picture that spoke louder than any confession. I saved the photos on my phone, letting their weight settle over me. She had broken our vows, destroyed our family's trust, and for what? A fling, a secret life hidden behind a thin veil of work trips and late nights. I could hardly breathe as I sat there, staring at the images, feeling a sense of resolve solidify inside me. Claire would have to face the truth, but she would do so on my terms. The next day, I called our lawyer, sharing the latest evidence, and we began putting together the final documents. My decision was unwavering, I wanted custody of the kids, and I wanted her out of our house. I knew it would hurt, knew that it would shatter whatever was left of our family, but it was a pain I was willing to endure. I refused to be the fool in her narrative, the husband who turned a blind eye to betrayal. I would be the one to control the ending of this story. A few days later, I came home early and found Claire in the kitchen, making dinner. She looked up with a smile, greeting me in that easy, familiar way, and for a moment, it was almost like old times. But the warmth in her gaze felt hollow, a reminder of the lies she'd cloaked herself in for so long. She set down a plate and poured a glass of wine, chatting about her day, oblivious to the storm brewing on my end of the table. I let her talk, absorbing every word, until she finally paused, glancing up at me with a faint frown. "Are you all right?" she asked, noticing my silence. I looked her in the eye, my voice steady. "We need to talk, Claire." The color drained from her face, and I could see the flicker of fear in her expression. She nodded slowly, setting her fork down. "What's this about?" I reached into my bag and pulled out the file, the photographs, the receipts, everything the investigator had collected. I slid it across the table, watching as her eyes widened, her hands trembling as she flipped through each page. Every photograph, every timestamp, every piece of evidence was there, laid out in stark black and white. She stared at the pages, her face a mask of shock and horror. When she finally looked up, tears glistened in her eyes. I can explain," she stammered. I held up a hand, stopping her. "Don't," I said, my voice cold. "I don't want explanations or excuses. I want honesty, something you've been incapable of for a long time. I know everything, Claire. I know about the hotel, the dinners, the work trips that weren't work trips. I know about Jeremy." She choked back a sob, her hands clutching the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. "I never meant to hurt you. I was just lost, confused. It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Save it," I replied, feeling a detached calm settle over me. "You destroyed everything we built, Claire. Our life, our family, it all meant nothing to you, did it?" "No, that's not true," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I love you. I love our family." She trailed off, unable to find the words, and in that moment, I saw the truth for what it was. She hadn't thought about our family, hadn't considered the consequences. Her actions had been selfish, reckless, driven by something she couldn't even articulate. "Maybe you thought you could have both lives," I said. "But that's not how this works. There are consequences for what you've done." She looked up at me, pleading. "Can't we work through this? For the kids' sake. I can change, I'll do anything." "The time for change was long before this," I said, cutting her off. "I'm filing for divorce, and I'll be pursuing full custody of the kids. You don't get to play the role of devoted wife and mother after everything you've done." The shock in her eyes deepened, and she looked at me as though seeing me for the first time. "You can't do this. You can't take them away from me." "You didn't give me much of a choice," I replied, feeling the anger simmer beneath my calm exterior. "I've given you trust, loyalty, and you betrayed all of it. This isn't a game, Claire. You broke our family, and now you're going to live with the consequences." Tears streamed down her face, but I felt nothing but a strange relief, a sense of finality that I hadn't anticipated. For too long, I'd lived in the shadow of her lies, trapped in a marriage that had become a charade. Now, I was free of it, free of her. She begged me, pleaded for a chance to make things right, but I remained resolute. Our marriage was over, and there was nothing left to salvage. By the time the conversation ended, I knew I had made the right choice, painful as it was. Claire had crossed a line that could never be erased, and no amount of apologies could change that. As she sobbed, I stood up, walking away from the table and out of the room, leaving her to grapple with the consequences of her actions. The chapter of our life together was closed, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. In the weeks following that night, I did everything I could to rebuild my life. I focused on the kids, who remained blissfully unaware of the darkness that had seeped into our home. Claire had moved out quietly, taking only a few of her belongings. We decided that keeping things civil was the best option for the kids, agreeing to avoid a custody battle. But in the quiet hours after I put the kids to bed, the silence was suffocating. It was a strange, hollow existence, this new chapter where I was both father and mother, alone in the house that once bustled with shared laughter and warmth. The divorce proceedings were clinical and efficient, papers signed without any more drama. Claire had been compliant, almost hauntingly so. She agreed to everything, full custody for me, generous visitation rights for her. The swiftness of it all left me reeling. I'd been ready for a fight, but it felt like she was running from something, her own guilt maybe, as if she couldn't bear to face the wreckage she'd caused. And maybe that was it. She came by once a week to see the kids, her demeanor somber but soft, her eyes filled with a remorse she never voiced out loud. It didn't make me hate her any less, but in some quiet way, I began to pity her. One evening, a few months after everything had settled, I received a call from Claire. Her voice was shaky, edged with panic, and I could hear her taking deep breaths, as if trying to keep herself from falling apart. She told me she needed to talk in person, that it was important, urgent even, and that it couldn't wait. Despite every bitter feeling I had, I agreed, mostly for the kids' sake. She was still their mother, and if there was something she needed to share, I felt I owed them at least that. When Claire arrived, she looked different, gaunt, almost fragile, as if she'd aged a decade since our last meeting. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and hollow. She'd clearly been crying, and as much as I wanted to feel anger, all I felt was concern. She walked in slowly, each step hesitant, and sat on the edge of the couch, wringing her hands, her gaze lowered. "What's going on, Claire?" I asked, unable to keep the worry out of my voice. She looked up at me, tears pooling in her eyes, and took a deep, shuddering breath. I need to tell you something. Something I've been hiding, even before all of this." I waited, tension coiling in my stomach, bracing myself for whatever was coming. After I moved out, I went to see a doctor. I hadn't been feeling well for a while, migraines, fatigue, some things I thought were just from stress. She paused, her voice wavering. "They ran some tests, and I have stage 4 cancer. It's terminal." The words hung in the air, sinking slowly, each one carrying an unbearable weight. My mind went blank, the reality of it too surreal, too monstrous to process. For a moment, all I could do was stare at her, uncomprehending, as though I'd misheard. But the raw agony in her expression, the way her hands trembled, told me it was true. Claire, the woman I'd once loved, the mother of my children, was dying. "Are you sure?" was all I could manage, my voice a strangled whisper. She nodded, her face crumbling as she tried to keep her composure. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I didn't know how to tell you. I've made so many mistakes, and this. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I can't leave without making things right with you, with the kids." A silence followed, deep and suffocating. In that moment, I felt every emotion collide inside me, grief, rage, confusion, and an overpowering sadness that gnawed at my heart. I wanted to scream at her, to demand why she'd ruined everything, why she'd let things fall apart so completely. But none of it mattered now. She was standing on the brink of an unimaginable end, and I couldn't turn my back on her, not in this final, bitter stretch of her life. The next few weeks became a blur of hospital visits and difficult conversations. Claire began treatment, a futile attempt to buy her a little more time, though we all knew it was a temporary measure. The kids, too young to fully grasp the gravity of the situation, knew only that their mother was sick. I told them she'd be around less often, and Claire took every opportunity to be with them, savoring moments that grew more precious with each passing day. Despite everything, she managed to smile for them, to give them memories of a mother who loved them, who cared deeply even if she had faltered. One day, while sitting by her bedside, Claire reached out and held my hand, her grip weak but insistent. I looked down at her, surprised, and saw a softness in her gaze that reminded me of the early days of our marriage. "I know I hurt you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know I ruined so much of what we had. But, thank you." Thank you for letting me be here, for letting me be with the kids. I never wanted it to end this way. A tear slipped down her cheek, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let go of my anger. I sat there, holding her hand, my own tears finally breaking free. I wasn't sure if I'd forgiven her, but at that moment, it didn't matter. What mattered was that she was here, fragile and human, facing an end I couldn't fathom. In the final weeks, as her strength faded, Claire came to live with us again, too weak to manage alone. I cared for her, helping her through the pain, and she allowed herself to rely on me, her pride and guilt fading into something simpler, something real. We shared stories with the kids, creating what peace we could for them, trying to make each day count. And as I watched her drift further away, I realized that life, with all its betrayals and wounds, held unexpected chances for closure, for understanding. Our love, though broken, found a quiet place of solace in those last days. On her last night, as she lay in the dim light, her breathing shallow and frail, she reached for my hand once more, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." She slipped away peacefully, leaving me alone in the quiet dawn, holding the ghost of her hand as the first light crept through the window.